What would you do if the man you love was suddenly standing beside another woman who seemed perfect for his world? In today's emotional drama, Tu Hoa's heart shatters when she unexpectedly sees CEO join at the market with the beautiful and wealthy Trang, forcing her to question whether love can truly overcome the gap between status and destiny. As misunderstandings grow and silent tears begin to fall, one painful moment may change everything. Subscribe now and join us for this unforgettable story filled with love, heartbreak, and powerful emotions. For more than a year, Tieu Hoa and CEO Join had quietly loved each other. Their relationship was never something they showed off to the world. There were no extravagant declarations of love and no public promises that attracted attention. Yet the feelings between them were genuine, growing stronger with every passing day. To Tieu Hoa, CEO Join was much more than a successful businessman. Most people saw him as a powerful CEO, a man with wealth, influence, and a future that seemed limitless. Whenever his name was mentioned, people spoke about his achievements, his company, and the luxurious life he lived. But Tieu Hoa never saw him that way. When she looked at CEO Join, she saw the man who always listened patiently whenever she talked about her day. She saw the man who encouraged her whenever she felt discouraged. She saw the man who treated her with kindness and respect despite the enormous difference between their social backgrounds. Life had never been easy for Tieu Hoa. Every morning before dawn, while most people were still asleep, she was already awake preparing vegetables for sale. She spent long hours at the market, standing under the sun, carrying heavy baskets, and serving customers one after another. Some days business was good, other days were disappointing, but regardless of how difficult life became, Tieu Hoa never stopped working hard. She believed that determination was the only thing she truly possessed. Perhaps that was one of the reasons CEO Join had fallen in love with her. In a world filled with people who constantly cared about money and status, Tieu Hoa remained sincere. She never approached him because of his wealth. She never expected expensive gifts. She never tried to take advantage of his position. Instead, she treated him exactly the same way she treated everyone else. That honesty touched CEO Join deeply. Whenever he spent time with Tieu Hoa, he felt a sense of peace that he could never find inside meeting rooms or business events. She reminded him of a simpler life, a happier life, a life where people cared about each other rather than social status. As time passed, his feelings for her became stronger. The gentle smile on Tieu Hoa's face gradually became one of the most important things in his life. Whenever she laughed, he found himself smiling too. Whenever she was upset, he worried. Whenever she struggled, he wanted to help. Although neither of them talked much about the future, they both secretly hoped that one day they could build a life together. Unfortunately, not everyone shared that hope. There was one person who had never truly accepted their relationship: CEO Join's mother. From the very beginning, Mrs. Trang opposed Tieu Hoa. She never openly created conflict between them, but her disapproval was obvious. In her eyes, Tieu Hoa simply wasn't suitable for her son. No matter how kind she was, no matter how hardworking she was, no matter how much CEO Join loved her, Mrs. Trang believed that marriage required more than love. She cared deeply about family background, wealth, education, and social status. And in all of those categories, Tieu Hoa failed to meet her expectations. Whenever Mrs. Trang imagined her son's future wife, she pictured someone completely different. Someone elegant, someone highly educated, someone from a wealthy family, someone capable of standing proudly beside the future heir of a large corporation. A vegetable seller from a small market was not the daughter-in-law she had dreamed of. The more she thought about it, the more dissatisfied she became. Meanwhile, CEO Join remained unaware of just how serious his mother's concerns had become. He knew she disapproved, but he believed that eventually she would understand how much Tieu Hoa meant to him. He hoped that one day she would accept their relationship. Unfortunately, Mrs. Tran had other plans. Over time, she began quietly searching for someone she considered more suitable. Someone who could replace Tieu Hoa in her son's heart. Someone who possessed everything Tieu Hoa lacked. And eventually she found that person, a young woman named Trang. The moment Mrs. Trang met Trang, she was impressed. Trang came from a wealthy and respected family. Her father was a successful real estate businessman. She was beautiful, intelligent, and carried herself with confidence. Everything about her matched the image Mrs. Tran had always imagined for her future daughter-in-law. As the days passed, Mrs. Tran became increasingly convinced that Trang was perfect for CEO Join. And one afternoon, she finally decided to make her move. Without telling her son in advance, she invited Trang to visit their home. As she prepared for the meeting, a satisfied smile appeared on her face. In her mind, this was the beginning of a new plan. A plan that she hoped would slowly push Tieu Hoa out of CEO Join's life. At that same moment, far away from the luxury of the Tran family residence, Tieu Hoa was still standing at her vegetable stall, completely unaware that a challenge to her relationship had already begun. The following afternoon, everything was prepared exactly the way Mrs. Tran wanted. She had spent the entire morning making sure the house looked perfect. Fresh flowers decorated the living room, tea was prepared in advance, and every detail had been carefully arranged. Today was important, because today, Trang was coming. Mrs. Tran sat in the living room, occasionally glancing at the clock. A few moments later, the doorbell rang. A satisfied smile immediately appeared on her face. She knew who it was. When the door opened, Trang stepped inside carrying a polite smile. She looked elegant and graceful. Her outfit was fashionable without being overly flashy. Her posture reflected confidence and refinement. Everything about her matched the image Mrs. Tran had always imagined for her future daughter-in-law. "Trang, you're here," Mrs. Tran said warmly. "Hello, Auntie." Trang greeted her respectfully before taking a seat. The two women quickly began chatting. As the conversation continued, Mrs. Tran became even more impressed. Trang spoke politely. She was intelligent. She knew how to carry a conversation. Most importantly, she came from a family whose social status perfectly matched that of the Tran family. The more Mrs. Tran listened, the happier she became. In her heart, she was already comparing Trang and Tieu Hoa. Unfortunately for Tieu Hoa, the comparison was completely unfair. Mrs. Tran only focused on wealth, education, and status. And in those areas, Trang appeared to have every advantage. Meanwhile, CEO Join was still busy at work. He had absolutely no idea that his mother was arranging this meeting behind his back. Hours later, as the afternoon sun began to soften, the sound of a car entering the driveway echoed outside. Mrs. Tran immediately looked toward the window. "He's home." Trang straightened slightly. Although she tried to remain calm, she couldn't completely hide her curiosity. After all, she had heard plenty about CEO Join. She knew he was successful. She knew he was respected. And she knew many women admired him. A few moments later, CEO Join walked through the front door. At first, he didn't notice anything unusual. Then his eyes landed on the unfamiliar young woman sitting beside his mother. He paused briefly. A small look of confusion appeared on his face. Mrs. Tran immediately smiled. "Join, come sit down." CEO Join nodded politely. As he approached, Trang stood up. "Hello, CEO Join." She offered a friendly smile. "My name is Trang." CEO Join shook her hand politely. "It's nice to meet you." "You too." Everyone sat down again. For a brief moment, silence filled the room. CEO Join looked at his mother. "Mom, do we have guests today?" Before Mrs. Tran could answer, she was already smiling. "Trang isn't just any guest." The tone of her voice immediately made CEO Join suspicious. Mrs. Tran continued, "Trang is an outstanding young woman." She turned toward Trang. "She's beautiful, intelligent, highly educated, and comes from a wonderful family." Trang looked slightly embarrassed. "Auntie, you're praising me too much." Mrs. Tran laughed. "I'm only telling the truth." CEO Join listened quietly. The conversation continued, and with every passing minute, his discomfort grew. It became increasingly obvious what his mother was trying to do. This wasn't a casual visit. This wasn't a business meeting. This was an introduction, a carefully planned introduction. Mrs. Tran looked from Trang to CEO Join and back again. A pleased smile appeared on her face. "You know something?" Neither of them responded. Mrs. Tran continued anyway. "The two of you look wonderful together." Trang lowered her gaze slightly. CEO Join immediately felt awkward. There it was, exactly what he had feared. He wanted to stop the conversation immediately. He wanted to remind his mother that he already loved someone. That someone was Tieu. But arguing in front of Trang would only create an uncomfortable situation, so he remained silent. Unfortunately, Mrs. Tran interpreted that silence as cooperation. Throughout the next hour, she continuously found reasons to keep the conversation going. She asked questions. She encouraged interaction. She repeatedly pointed out similarities between them. Both of you are successful. You have similar interests. You understand the business world. Again and again, she tried to emphasize how compatible they appeared. Trang remained friendly throughout the entire conversation. She asked CEO Join about his work. She listened carefully whenever he answered. She smiled often. She did everything possible to maintain a pleasant atmosphere. From an outsider's perspective, the meeting seemed successful, but inside, CEO Join felt increasingly trapped. His thoughts repeatedly drifted elsewhere. Toward Tieu. He remembered her gentle smile. He remembered the warmth in her eyes whenever they met. He remembered the peaceful feeling he experienced whenever he was with her. Compared to those memories, everything happening inside the living room felt artificial. Time moved slowly. Eventually, late afternoon arrived. Just when CEO Join thought the visit was finally coming to an end, Mrs. Tran suddenly reached down and rubbed her leg. A slight frown appeared on her face. "Oh dear!" CEO Join immediately looked concerned. "What's wrong?" "My leg hurts again." The concern on his face deepened. "Should I call a doctor?" Mrs. Tran quickly shook her head. No, it's not serious." Then she sighed dramatically. "I wanted to go to the market to buy ingredients for dinner." She paused. "But my leg hurts too much to walk." Trang immediately responded. "I can help buy whatever you need." Mrs. Tran smiled warmly. "That's very kind of you." Then she slowly turned toward her son. The moment CEO Join saw that look, he knew exactly what was coming. "Join." "Yes, Mom." "Take Trang to the market for me." The room became quiet. CEO Join looked at his mother. Mrs. Tran smiled innocently. Asking a young lady to go alone would be rude. CEO Join remained silent. He knew this had nothing to do with groceries. This was simply another opportunity for him and Trang to spend time together. Part of him wanted to refuse, but he could already imagine the argument that would follow. After a brief pause, he finally sighed. "All right." Mrs. Tran's face immediately brightened. "Good." Trang smiled politely. "Thank you." CEO Join simply nodded. A few minutes later, they left the house together. As they walked toward the car, CEO Join felt an uncomfortable weight in his chest. Something about the situation bothered him. He couldn't explain why. Meanwhile, back inside the house, Mrs. Tran stood near the window watching them leave. A satisfied smile slowly spread across her face. Everything seemed to be progressing exactly according to plan. Outside, CEO Join opened the passenger door for Trang. She thanked him before getting into the car. Moments later, the vehicle pulled away from the house. Neither of them realized that this simple trip to the market was about to create a misunderstanding. Neither Tieu nor CEO Join would ever forget. As the car disappeared down the road, the busy afternoon market continued operating as usual. Customers moved between stalls. Vendors called out to attract buyers. Fresh vegetables filled the narrow walkways. And standing behind one of those vegetable stalls was Tieu. She continued arranging vegetables and serving customers, completely unaware that CEO Join and Trang were already on their way there. As CEO Join's car made its way toward the market, silence filled the vehicle for the first few minutes. Neither of them seemed to know what to say. Trang sat quietly in the passenger seat, occasionally looking out the window at the busy streets passing by. CEO Join focused on driving. Although he appeared calm on the outside, his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. He kept thinking about Tieu. He wondered how her day was going. He wondered whether business at the market had been good. He wondered if she had remembered to take a break and eat something. The thought made him smile slightly. Unfortunately, the smile disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Trang happened to notice. "You seem to be thinking about something?" CEO Join glanced at her briefly. "Just work," Trang nodded. "I can understand that. Running a large company must be stressful." "It can be." After a short pause, Trang tried again. "Auntie talks about you a lot." CEO Join gave a polite smile. "Hopefully not too much." Trang laughed softly. "Actually, she seems very proud of you." CEO Join didn't respond immediately. He already knew where this conversation was heading. Thankfully, Trang didn't push the subject any further. Instead, she looked outside again. The car continued moving through the afternoon traffic. Eventually, the crowded market came into view. Rows of stalls stretched along the narrow streets. Customers moved in every direction, carrying bags of groceries. The atmosphere was lively and energetic. After parking the car, CEO Join and Trang stepped out. The noise of the marketplace immediately surrounded them. Vendors called out prices, customers bargained, children followed their parents between stalls. The entire area was filled with movement. Trang looked around curiously. "It's been years since I've visited a traditional market." "There are usually a lot of people here," CEO Join replied. Trang smiled. "I can see that." The two of them began walking deeper into the market. Several vendors greeted them as they passed. A few people turned their heads to look. It wasn't difficult to understand why. Trang's elegant appearance naturally attracted attention. Her clothes were stylish and expensive. Her posture reflected confidence. Meanwhile, CEO Join's handsome appearance and professional demeanor made him stand out as well. Walking side by side, they appeared to be a perfect match. At least that was how it looked from the outside. Neither of them realized that someone important was only a short distance away. Meanwhile, Tieu continued working at her vegetable stall. The afternoon had been relatively busy. Customers came and went continuously. Although her feet ached from standing for hours, she remained focused on her work. She carefully arranged bundles of vegetables, collected payments, answered questions, and greeted customers with her usual kindness. To everyone around her, it seemed like a normal day. But deep inside, Tieu felt happy. The reason was simple. She had been thinking about CEO Join all afternoon. Even a brief memory of him was enough to make her smile. For more than a year, he had become one of the most important people in her life. Whenever things became difficult, thoughts of him gave her strength. Whenever she felt lonely, remembering his encouragement made her feel better. She never asked for luxury. She never dreamed about wealth. As long as CEO Join was by her side, she felt fortunate enough. Unfortunately, fate had prepared a cruel surprise for her. Not far away, CEO Join and Trang continued walking through the market. "We should buy the vegetables first," Trang suggested. CEO Join nodded. "That sounds fine." They turned into another row of stalls. The distance between them and Tieu grew smaller with every step. A few moments later, everything changed. Tieu had just finished arranging a bundle of water spinach. As she bent down to reach another basket, a familiar voice suddenly drifted through the crowd. "We still need some vegetables." Her hand froze instantly. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. Slowly, she lifted her head. Her heart began beating faster. That voice, it sounded familiar. Far too familiar. Carefully, she looked toward the direction from which the voice had come. The moment her eyes found the source, her entire body became still. It was CEO Join, standing only a few meters away. For several seconds, Tieu Hoa couldn't move. She simply stared. Part of her wanted to smile. Part of her wanted to call his name. Part of her wanted to walk over and greet him. But then she noticed someone standing beside him. Trang, the elegant young woman she had never seen before. Everything inside Tieu Hoa seemed to stop. The smile that had begun forming on her lips disappeared instantly. Her eyes remained fixed on the scene in front of her. Trang stood close to CEO Join. The two of them appeared comfortable together, natural together. As they examined vegetables displayed at nearby stalls, they occasionally exchanged comments and small smiles. Nothing about their behavior was unusual. Nothing about it was inappropriate. Yet to Tieu Hoa, the sight felt like a knife piercing her heart. A painful sensation spread through her chest. For the first time, she truly saw the difference between her world and CEO Join's world. The difference she had spent so long trying to ignore. Trang looked beautiful, elegant, sophisticated. Her clothes alone probably cost more than Tieu Hoa earned in months. Everything about her reflected wealth and status. Standing beside her, CEO Join looked perfectly natural, perfectly matched, as though they belonged to the same world, as though they had always belonged there. Without realizing it, Tieu Hoa tightened her grip around the vegetables in her hands. The stems bent beneath the pressure. Her fingers trembled slightly. Countless thoughts rushed through her mind. Who was that woman? Why were they together? Had CEO Join brought her here? Was she someone important? Had his family introduced them? The questions came one after another, and with each question, the pain inside her chest grew stronger. Across the market, CEO Join was looking at a nearby stall when something caught his attention. Almost instinctively, he glanced in another direction. The moment he did, his expression changed. His eyes widened slightly, because standing behind a vegetable stall was Tieu Hoa. For a brief moment, he forgot everything around him. The noise, the crowd, the market. Everything disappeared. All he could see was Tieu Hoa. And judging by the expression on her face, she had already seen him. A terrible feeling settled in his chest. He immediately understood how the situation must look. From where she stood, it appeared as though he and Trang had come to the market together, like a couple, like two people enjoying time together. The realization made his heart sink. He wanted to explain immediately. He wanted to walk over to her. He wanted to tell her the truth. But before he could do anything, Trang turned toward him. Which vegetables do you think Auntie would prefer? CEO Join barely heard the question. His attention remained fixed on Tieu Hoa. Even from several meters away, he could see confusion in her eyes. And beneath that confusion, something far more painful beginning to appear. Heartbreak. At that moment, neither Tieu Hoa nor CEO Join spoke a single word. Yet the misunderstanding between them had already begun, and neither of them realized how deeply it was about to hurt. For several long seconds, neither Tieu Hoa nor CEO Join moved. The bustling market around them continued as usual. Customers bargained with vendors. Children ran between the crowded stalls. Voices rose and fell from every direction. Yet for Tieu Hoa, all those sounds seemed to fade into the background. Her eyes remained fixed on CEO Join and the young woman standing beside him. The scene before her felt impossible to ignore. Trang was beautiful. There was no denying it. Even from a distance, Tieu Hoa could see how elegant she looked. Her clothes were fashionable and refined. Her posture was graceful. The confidence she carried made her stand out effortlessly among the crowd. Most importantly, she looked like someone who belonged in CEO Join's world. Someone who would never be questioned by his family. Someone who would never be judged because of her background. Someone who could stand proudly beside the future heir of a powerful corporation. The realization hurt more than Tieu Hoa wanted to admit. Without realizing it, her breathing became uneven. Her chest felt tight. A painful knot formed in her throat. For more than a year, she had tried not to think about the differences between herself and CEO Join. Whenever doubts appeared, she pushed them away. Whenever people questioned their relationship, she told herself that love mattered more than status. Whenever she remembered Mrs. Tran's disapproval, she convinced herself that one day everything would work out. But now, standing in the middle of the market, those doubts returned stronger than ever. Because for the first time, she was seeing the comparison with her own eyes. And it was impossible to ignore. Trang and CEO Join looked as though they belonged together. The thought pierced her heart. Across the market, CEO Join felt a wave of panic. The moment he saw the expression on Tieu's face, he knew she had misunderstood. He wanted to explain. He wanted to walk over to her immediately. He wanted to tell her that nothing had changed, that he still loved her, that Trang meant nothing more than a situation his mother had arranged. But his feet refused to move. The circumstances trapped him. Trang was standing right beside him. The crowded marketplace surrounded them. And most importantly, he could already see the hurt in Tieu's eyes, a hurt he never wanted to cause. CEO Join? Trang's voice interrupted his thoughts. He blinked. What? You seem distracted. I'm fine. But he wasn't fine. Not even close. His gaze drifted back toward Tieu. The sight of her standing there broke his heart. Meanwhile, Tieu quickly lowered her eyes. She didn't want to look anymore. Yet no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop thinking about what she had just seen. The image repeated itself again and again inside her mind. CEO Join beside Trang. Trang beside CEO Join. The more she thought about it, the heavier her heart became. A customer approached her stall. Can I get 2 bundles of these vegetables? For a moment, Tieu didn't respond. The customer repeated the question. Only then did she force herself back to reality. Yes, of course. Her voice trembled slightly. She quickly picked up the vegetables and handed them over. The customer paid and walked away without noticing anything unusual. But Tieu noticed. She noticed how difficult it had become to maintain her composure. She noticed how hard it was to stop her hands from shaking. Most of all, she noticed the tears beginning to gather in her eyes. She lowered her head immediately. She couldn't let anyone see, not the customers, not the other vendors, and especially not CEO Join. Unfortunately, emotions are not always easy to control. A single tear escaped despite her efforts. It slid slowly down her cheek. Then another followed. Tiny droplets fell onto the vegetables she was holding. The tears blended with the water already clinging to the fresh leaves. Tieu bit her lip. She quickly wiped her face. But the tears kept coming. Each one carried a mixture of sadness, insecurity, and disappointment. Not disappointment in CEO Join, never in him. The painful truth was that she wasn't angry at him at all. Instead, she was angry at herself. She blamed herself for feeling hurt. She blamed herself for hoping. She blamed herself for forgetting how different their worlds truly were. Across the market, CEO Join saw everything. He saw her lower her head. He saw her wipe away tears. And when he realized she was crying, his heart clenched painfully. The sight felt unbearable. For more than a year, he had promised himself that he would protect her, that he would never be the reason she suffered. Yet now, without saying a single word, he had become exactly that. His hands tightened into fists. Every instinct inside him told him to go to her, to explain everything immediately, to tell her the truth, to reassure her, to stop her tears before they fell any further. But he couldn't. Not there. Not in that moment. The situation felt cruel. He was only a few meters away, yet the distance between them suddenly felt impossible to cross. Trang followed his gaze again. This time she noticed the vegetable stall. She noticed Tieu standing there, but she didn't understand the connection. To her, Tieu was simply another vendor in the crowded market. Nothing more. Meanwhile, Tieu continued serving customers despite the storm raging inside her heart. Every smile she forced felt painful. Every word she spoke felt heavy. Still, she kept working, because stopping would only make things worse. If she allowed herself to fully process what she was feeling, she feared she might completely break down. The afternoon sunlight slowly faded across the market. The crowd continued moving around her. Life carried on exactly as it always had. Yet something inside Tieu had changed. For the first time since falling in love with CEO Join, she felt truly small, not because of anything he had done, not because of anything Trang had said, but because she suddenly became aware of everything she lacked. She looked at her rough hands, hands shaped by years of hard work, hands that carried baskets every day, hands that smelled of vegetables and soil. Then she thought about Trang, elegant, educated, wealthy, refined. The comparison felt merciless. Another tear slipped down her cheek. This time she didn't wipe it away immediately. Instead, she stared quietly at the vegetables in front of her. The green leaves blurred through her tears. A painful thought slowly settled into her heart. Maybe this was reality. Maybe people like CEO Join were always meant to be with people like Trang. People from wealthy families. People with impressive backgrounds. People who belonged in the same social circles. People whose presence would make parents proud. What place could a vegetable seller possibly have in that world? The question echoed endlessly in her mind. And the more she thought about it, the more her confidence disappeared. Across the market, CEO Join remained frozen. He desperately wanted to explain. He desperately wanted to erase the misunderstanding, but the opportunity never came. All he could do was watch. Watch the woman he loved silently suffer. Watch her lower her head and hide her tears. Watch the pain grow deeper with every passing second. It was one of the most helpless moments he had ever experienced. Meanwhile, Tieu finally took a deep breath. Slowly, she wiped away her tears once more. Then she turned her attention back to her work. Customer after customer approached her stall, and she greeted each of them the same way she always did. No one could see the heartbreak hidden behind her smile. No one could see the battle taking place inside her heart. Because Tieu wasn't blaming CEO Join. She wasn't even blaming Trang. The only person she blamed was herself. As she stared down at the vegetables in front of her, a final painful thought filled her mind. She didn't blame CEO Join. She only blamed herself for being so poor that she wasn't worthy of standing beside him. For more than a year, Tieu and CEO Join had shared a quiet but sincere love, despite the huge gap between their worlds. While Tieu saw Join as her greatest source of comfort and support, Join admired her kindness, strength, and genuine heart. However, his mother never approved of their relationship and dreamed of finding a wealthier, more suitable partner for her son. One day, she introduced Trang, the beautiful and sophisticated daughter of a wealthy businessman, hoping to bring her closer to Join. When she arranged for CEO Join and Trang to visit the market together, neither of them expected Tieu to see them. Standing behind her vegetable stall, Tieu watched the two together and felt her heart break. As painful doubts filled her mind, she began questioning whether someone like her could ever truly belong in CEO Join's world.